Entire cities and cultures have vanished without a trace. History conceals silent chapters where forgotten cataclysms wiped out entire civilizations. We are about to uncover 20 of these earth-shattering events, revealing how natural disasters, climate shifts, and unforeseen forces led to the collapse of societies lost to time. By the end, you will possess a profound understanding of the fragile line between human achievement and total oblivion. We will journey from a Mediterranean island torn apart by a volcano to a vast desert plain swallowed by the sea. What crucial lesson do these ancient collapses hold for our own world today? A colossal volcanic explosion tore the island of Thera apart. The very earth shattered, sending a plume of ash and rock soaring miles into the sky and triggering tsunamis that crashed against the shores of Crete, the heartland of the sophisticated Minoan civilization. This was not a mere rumble, but one of the most violent volcanic events in human history, occurring around 1600 BCE. The Minoans were a people of remarkable achievement, known for their sprawling, intricate palace complexes at Knossos and their vibrant art that depicted a peaceful, seafaring culture. In an instant, their world was plunged into chaos. Geologists like Floyd McCoy point to the sheer scale of the eruption, which ejected unimaginable volumes of material, darkening the skies and casting a thick blanket of abrasive ash across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Tsunami waves, perhaps stories high, smashed into northern coastal settlements, scouring the land and obliterating the vital Minoan fleet that connected them to the wider world. Archaeological digs along the Cretan coastline reveal layers of sea-borne debris and smashed buildings, clear testaments to this wall of water. Then came the ashfall, a relentless downpour that suffocated farmlands, poisoned the soil, and collapsed roofs under its weight. This double blow crippled their agriculture and shattered their trade networks, the very foundations of their wealth and power. On Thera itself, at the site of Akrotiri, we find a haunting snapshot of this advanced society, a city beautifully preserved under the volcanic ash, much like Pompeii. Its multi-story buildings, elaborate frescoes, and sophisticated drainage systems speak of a culture frozen at its peak, only to be buried and forgotten. How does the sudden silencing of such a vibrant culture make us reconsider the sturdiness of our own interconnected world? What would happen if a similar cataclysm struck a densely populated coastal region today? The story of the Minoans is a stark lesson in geological fortune, showing how a single, violent event can erase a civilization's footprint almost overnight, leading us to a collapse driven not by fire, but by a much slower, creeping force. From a civilization shattered by fire and water, we journey to one brought low by a profound and relentless silence, the silence of rain that never falls. The vast, arid plains of Mesopotamia hold the ghost of the Akkadian Empire, the world's first multi-ethnic empire, forged by the legendary Sargon the Great. Its collapse around 2200 BCE stands as a haunting testament to a cataclysm of a different kind, a creeping disaster of climate. Climate scientists drilling into the region's ancient lakes and seabeds have uncovered a chilling story written in sediment cores. They reveal a sharp, brutal shift to intensely arid conditions that gripped the land for not just years, but for centuries. This was not a simple dry spell. It was a climatic event so severe it rewrote the destiny of an entire civilization. The empire's agricultural heartland, dependent on consistent rainfall, simply withered and died. Crops failed season after season, leading to widespread famine. This breakdown of the food supply shattered the empire's economic foundation. triggering social unrest and the inevitable disintegration of central authority. The city of Tel Leilan in modern-day Syria offers stark physical proof. A distinct layer of wind-blown dust sits directly atop the ruins of the occupied city, marking the precise moment it was abandoned, its streets left to be buried by the encroaching desert. Ancient cuneiform tablets from the era echo this physical evidence, speaking of calamities, of salt filling the fields, and of great migrations of desperate people. Across northern Mesopotamia, archaeological surveys show a dramatic pattern, a widespread abandonment of settlements as populations either dispersed into nomadic groups or fled south in search of water. The mighty Akkadian Empire did not fall to an invading army, but to an invisible, implacable enemy, a changing sky. How would our modern global society, with its vast populations and complex supply chains, withstand a drought lasting 300 years? The story of the Akkadians forces us to confront our own vulnerability and reconsider what true resource management means for our long-term survival. This lesson in climatic fragility finds a terrifying parallel in a civilization that mastered its environment, only to be betrayed by it in a land across the world. The silence that fell over the Indus Valley was one of order slowly succumbing to chaos. Across a vast expanse of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, marvels of ancient urban planning, began to empty out. This was not a civilization known for grand palaces or warrior kings, but for its breathtaking practicality. Their cities were laid out in precise grid patterns, equipped with the world's first known sanitation systems, with indoor toilets and drains that ran beneath the streets. Yet around 1900 BCE, this pinnacle of early urban life entered a period of irreversible decline. The cause was not a dramatic invasion or a single volcanic blast, but a slow, creeping environmental unraveling that choked the life from their land. At the heart of this collapse was a vital river system, the Gaga Hakra, often identified with the mythical Saraswati River. Scholars like Gregory Posseil point to compelling evidence that tectonic shifts deep beneath the earth began to steal their water. The rivers that fed their agricultural fields and filled their wells gradually changed course, slipping away to new channels and leaving the old ones to wither into dust. This geological betrayal was compounded by a larger climatic shift, a weakening of the monsoonal rains that had sustained the region for centuries. The result was a slow-motion disaster. Crops failed as the land grew parched, and the intricate trade networks that connected them to distant Mesopotamia began to fray. We see this quiet demise written in the layers of Mohenjo-Daro itself. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of repeated catastrophic flooding, followed by desperate attempts to rebuild atop the silt and mud. Each rebuilding was a little less grand, a little more haphazard than the last, until finally, the effort was abandoned altogether. There are no layers of ash from great fires, no mass graves of victims slain in battle. The end of the Indus Valley civilization was a gradual deurbanization, a deliberate dispersal. People did not die in their cities, they simply left them, migrating to smaller, more sustainable villages in the foothills where water was still reliable. How does this peaceful, almost orderly, decline challenge our ideas of civilizational collapse? It presents a scenario where a society, for all its brilliant planning and engineering, could not outlast the whims of a changing planet. Their resilience was not enough. The people of the Indus Valley did not go down fighting. They simply adapted, scattering and returning to a simpler way of life. Their story forces a haunting question upon our modern world, filled with megacities dependent on complex infrastructure. What happens when the environmental pressures mount, when the water sources shift or run dry? Are our own immense urban centers any less vulnerable to a slow burn catastrophe? The Indus Valley reminds us that a collapse does not always need a villain. Sometimes nature itself, shifting silently and inexorably, is enough. This narrative of the earth itself turning against its inhabitants finds a terrifying echo in another part of the ancient world, where the very ground shook with destructive fury. The ground itself seemed to turn against the Mycenaeans. In the waning years of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, a cascade of violent earthquakes shook the very foundations of their world. These were not isolated tremors, but a series of massive quakes rippling through the fault-riddled Aegean, toppling the monumental stone walls that had defined their power. The great citadels of Mycenae and Turins, with their cyclopean masonry, were not just damaged, they were broken. At Turins, the archaeological record is stark, with massive stone blocks tilted at impossible angles and deep fractures running through the palace foundations, clear testimony to a force that could not be fortified against. This seismic catastrophe did more than shatter buildings, it shattered a system. The palaces were the nerve centers of a complex, centralized economy, controlling the production of luxury goods, storing vast agricultural surpluses, and managing far-flung trade routes across the Mediterranean. When these hubs crumbled, the entire network collapsed. With the palaces gone, the specialized crafts like pottery and metalworking disappeared. The administrative scribes, who used the Linear B script to record everything from sheep counts to religious offerings, simply vanished, and literacy was lost for centuries. This physical destruction likely ignited a chain reaction of social collapse. The ruling warrior elite, their legitimacy tied to the palaces and their wealth, saw their authority evaporate overnight. Famine and internal strife would have followed the breakdown of trade and storage, leaving the population vulnerable and desperate. The earthquakes may have also opened the door to external threats, with the so-called sea peoples often cited as invaders who capitalized on this profound weakness. The result was a descent into a dark age, a period of depopulation, poverty, and cultural amnesia that lasted for generations. How does a society built on such intricate and centralized control survive when its physical and administrative hearts are simultaneously destroyed? The Mycenaean collapse is a sobering lesson in systemic fragility. Our modern world, with its own dense networks of supply chains and digital infrastructure, is arguably even more interconnected. A major seismic event in a key global hub today would not just be a local tragedy, but a worldwide shock. The story of the Mycenaeans forces us to ask if our own complex systems are resilient, or if they are simply waiting for the right shock to unravel them completely. And as one civilization fell to the shaking earth, another would soon be felled by an invisible, breath-borne enemy, a plague that would bring a mighty empire to its knees. A silent, breath-borne enemy brought the Hittite Empire to its knees. In the capital city of Hattusa, a formidable stronghold of stone in ancient Anatolia, the streets grew quiet not from conquest but from contagion. Around 1200 BCE, this dominant power of the late Bronze Age began to crumble, and a devastating plague appears to have been the poison that seeped into its foundations. Historical texts from the era speak repeatedly of a terrible pestilence ravaging the Hittite lands. Scholars like Trevor Bryce interpret these ancient records as describing a disease so widespread it crippled the empire from within. This was not a minor outbreak, but a biological cataclysm that struck at the very core of Hittite strength. A society built on a powerful army and a centralized bureaucracy cannot function when its soldiers are too weak to hold a spear and its scribes and administrators are dying at their posts. The evidence for this collapse is chillingly clear. Archaeological findings point to evidence of mass burials, suggesting a population overwhelmed by death, unable to follow traditional rites. At the same time, the clay tablets that document Hittite life, their royal decrees and economic records, show a rapid and dramatic decline, simply stopping as the administrative system that produced them ceased to exist. This internal decay made the empire a target. Already reeling from the plague, the Hittites faced simultaneous external attacks from the mysterious coalition known as the Sea Peoples and internal rebellions from subject states. The empire, hollowed out by disease, could not withstand the pressure. It fragmented, and its great cities, including Hattusa itself, were abandoned to the elements. We even find hints of this cross-regional health crisis in diplomatic correspondence. Letters between Hittite and Egyptian rulers nervously discussed diseases, indicating that this was a threat recognized and feared across the ancient Near East. How does a pandemic test the ultimate resilience of an empire? The Hittite case suggests that even the most powerful military state is vulnerable to an invisible enemy with no army to defeat. It forces us to ask a sobering question for our own interconnected world. Could a disease alone cause a civilization to collapse? For the Hittites, the plague was the critical blow that broke their system, a stark reminder that human history can be reshaped not just by earthquakes and droughts, but by microscopic pathogens. This biological devastation finds a strange parallel in a collapse driven not by a fever, but by a deep and lasting chill, a climatic event that froze a continent in its tracks. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age did not just decline, it shattered. Around 1177 BCE, a vast network of empires and kingdoms that stretched from Greece to Egypt crumbled almost simultaneously. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a swift and catastrophic failure that plunged the entire Eastern Mediterranean into a dark age. For centuries, this civilization had thrived on complex trade, diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets, and mighty palaces. Then, in a remarkably short period, it was all gone. The grand palaces of the Mycenaeans were burned, the Hittite Empire vanished, and even Egypt was pushed to the brink, its power permanently diminished. What could possibly cause such a widespread and rapid downfall? The answer appears to be a perfect storm of calamities, where environmental change acted as the trigger. Recent scientific analysis of ancient tree rings and ice cores reveals a stark climatic shift known as the 3.2 kiloyear event. This was a period of profound cooling and drying that gripped the region for decades. This was not a simple bad season. It was a long-term alteration of the climate that drastically reduced agricultural yields. Famines spread, weakening populations and making them vulnerable to disease and social unrest. This environmental stress set the stage for a chain reaction. The famous Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of marauders, began ravaging coastlines. Yet they were likely as much a symptom as a cause, perhaps desperate migrants themselves, displaced by the same climatic upheavals that were crippling the great empires. Internal rebellions and system-wide failures completed the catastrophe. The wealthy port city of Ugar in modern-day Syria offers a heartbreaking snapshot of this final hour. Archaeological excavations show a thick destruction layer from a violent conflagration. Even more poignant, clay tablets found in the city's ruins contain frantic, final letters. One message describes enemy ships already sighted, while another pleads for help from a neighboring king, stating that all their troops were deployed elsewhere and their city was defenseless. Ugarit was destroyed and never reoccupied. The collapse was so total that literacy, bureaucracy, and advanced technologies like intricate glass-making were lost for centuries. How do multiple, interconnected stressors combine to overwhelm a society's ability to cope? The Bronze Age collapse is the ultimate historical lesson in systemic risk. It shows that a civilization is not a single pillar, but a web of interconnected strands. When climate strain, mass migration, and internal failure pull on those strands at once, the entire structure can disintegrate with breathtaking speed. Are our own globally connected societies, with their just-in-time supply chains and digital networks, any more resilient to a similar convergence of crises? The silent shift in the ancient climate set in motion a domino effect that toppled empires, a reminder that our fate is often tied to forces far beyond our control. This narrative of a world destabilized by geological forces finds a terrifying echo in a single, colossal volcanic eruption that would darken an entire continent. Ash rained down for weeks, turning day into night. Around 450 CE, the Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador detonated with a force unmatched in 7,000 years. This was not a local disaster, it was a continental event, a VEI-6 eruption that ejected over 50 cubic kilometers of dense rock and ash into the atmosphere. The immediate devastation was absolute. Vast regions of the southern Maya lowlands, a heartland of cultural achievement, were buried under meters of sterile volcanic ash, suffocating farmland and poisoning water sources for generations. This single geological event is directly linked to a profound period known as the Maya hiatus, a decades-long pause in the construction of grand temples and the carving of royal monuments across the region. At the great city of Capon in Honduras, archaeologists find a distinct, thick layer of Ilopango's distinctive greenish ash directly interrupting the cultural sequence. Below it lies evidence of a vibrant, growing city. Above it, a long silence. The catastrophe forced a dramatic human reshuffling. Populations in the most severely affected zones had no choice but to abandon their cities and migrate. We see this in the rise of new centers in the northern Yucatan, areas that were spared the worst of the fallout. The city of Caminaljuyu in the Guatemalan highlands, once a powerful and influential capital, shows a stark decline in its monumental building projects immediately after the eruption, its political and economic power seemingly broken. The eruption's reach was even more vast than its ashfall. Scientists suggest it injected so much sulfur into the stratosphere that it likely triggered a period of global cooling, disrupting weather patterns far from Mesoamerica. How do societies recover from such a comprehensive environmental reset? The Maya response was not extinction, but adaptation. They regrouped, they moved, and they ultimately forged a new cultural zenith in different lands, a testament to human resilience. Yet their story forces a stark question upon our modern world. A similar super-eruption today, near a densely populated region like Southeast Asia or Europe, would not just disrupt agriculture, it would collapse global supply chains and trigger mass famine on an unimaginable scale. Are our complex international systems any more resilient than the classic Maya world? The Ilopango eruption proves that nature holds the ultimate power to rewrite human history in a single, violent act. This narrative of a landscape violently reshaped finds a slower, more insidious parallel in a civilization that watched its lifeblood, its great river, simply change its mind and abandon them. The very water that nurtured the Liangzhu culture became its executioner. In the lush Yangtze River Delta around 2300 BCE, a society of remarkable sophistication met a sudden, watery end. The Liangzhu people were masters of their environment, celebrated for their exquisite jade carvings and, most importantly, for their brilliant hydraulic engineering. They built an elaborate system of canals, dams, and reservoirs to control water for their sprawling rice paddies, creating a prosperous and stable civilization. Then catastrophe arrived not from the sky, but from a river hundreds of miles away. Geological evidence points to a dramatic event known as an avulsion, a sudden shift in the course of the mighty Yellow River. Imagine a river of that scale abruptly changing its mind, abandoning its ancient bed and charging south, its colossal volume of water and silt pouring directly into the Liangzhu heartland. Researchers like Zhanghua Wang have studied sediment cores from the region, and the story they tell is unmistakable. Deep beneath the surface, they find a clean, sharp line. Below that line, the soil shows the organized layers of a thriving agricultural society. Above it lies a thick, chaotic deposit of flood-borne silt, a geological tombstone marking the moment the Liangzhu world drowned. This was not a single season of high water. It was a permanent rewiring of the landscape. The intricate canals and dams, the very symbols of Liangzhu ingenuity, were instantly overwhelmed. Their carefully managed rice paddies were buried under meters of sterile mud, rendering them useless for generations. Settlements were inundated and abandoned. The archaeological site of Liangzhu city itself, a testament to their advanced urban planning, shows clear signs of this deluge, with its grand structures and water management systems silenced under layers of sediment. The cultural collapse was total. After this event, there is no continuation of their unique art, their jade working traditions, or their social complexity in the area. The population simply scattered, their political and economic unity shattered by famine and displacement. How does a society's greatest strength become its ultimate vulnerability? The Liangzhu had built a civilization perfectly adapted to a specific water system, and when that system was violently reconfigured by a distant, unpredictable event, their entire foundation washed away. For modern megacities built on river deltas from New Orleans to Shanghai, the lesson is stark. Our own vast networks of levees and pumps represent a similar wager against nature's power. The Liangzhu collapse forces us to ask if our engineering is truly mastering the environment, or merely setting the stage for a far greater disaster when nature inevitably reasserts its will. This story of a civilization undone by the very element it sought to control finds a haunting parallel in a culture that watched its world slowly turn to dust. Even in the heart of the Sahara, a civilization found a way to flourish. The Garamantes of ancient Libya were not mere survivors in a desert. They were masters of it, building a powerful kingdom that lasted for over 1,000 years. Their secret was an incredible network of underground tunnels known as fagaras, ingenious channels that tapped into ancient fossil water trapped deep beneath the sand. These tunnels, some stretching for miles, allowed them to create a vast oasis of lush farmland where there should have been only barren rock and dunes. Their capital, Garama, became a bustling center of trade and culture, a green jewel in a sea of sand, but their triumph contained the seeds of their own demise. This was a slow-motion collapse driven not by a sudden cataclysm, but by the quiet, relentless draining of their lifeblood. Archaeologist David Mattingly's research paints a stark picture of this gradual end. The Garamantes were mining water that had taken millennia to accumulate, and their ever-expanding network of fagaras caused the water table to fall, year after year, century after century. Maintaining the tunnels became a desperate, losing battle against collapsing shafts and silting sand. The land, once green, began to revert to desert as the water simply ran out. At sites like Jerma, the archaeological evidence is clear. The fagaras fell into disuse, choked with debris and abandoned. Their agricultural base crumbled, and with it, their centralized power and complex society. This internal environmental decay made them vulnerable to external pressures. Raids from nomadic tribes and the broader political shifts brought by the expansion of Islam further strained their resources. The population began a long, slow decline, not through a single dramatic event, but through a gradual dispersal. People abandoned the great oasis cities, their homes slowly buried by the encroaching dunes, and many were likely absorbed into the nomadic cultures that had once been their rivals. The capital of Garama was ultimately left to the desert winds. How does a society that so brilliantly overcame its environmental limits ultimately fall to those very same limits? The Garamantes were not ignorant, they were ingenious, yet their technology created a false sense of security, allowing them to live beyond their means for generations until the account was finally empty. Their story forces a critical question for our modern world, where vast cities in arid regions from Phoenix to Riyadh depend on similar, massive engineering projects to draw down ancient aquifers. Can technology forever outpace the fundamental realities of a finite resource? The Garamantian collapse is a haunting lesson in sustainability, a warning that the most dangerous cataclysm can be the one that happens so slowly we fail to see it until it is too late. This slow erosion of a civilization's foundation finds a powerful parallel in another ancient society that watched its very soil, the source of its wealth, literally wash out to sea. The silent Moai of Rapa Nui stare out from a landscape they helped to exhaust. On this remote island, one of the most isolated places on Earth, a thriving Polynesian society engineered its own undoing through a slow, grinding ecological catastrophe. The civilization here did not fall to a volcano or a sudden flood, but to the gradual loss of the very ground beneath its feet. The Rapa Nui people were master navigators and builders, but their greatest challenge became their own island's fragile ecosystem. Their story is a profound lesson in how a society cut off from the wider world can consume its own future. The central tragedy was deforestation. To transport and erect the colossal Moai statues, they needed massive quantities of wood for ropes and rollers. They also cleared land for agriculture and used wood for fuel and canoe building. Over centuries, this relentless demand led to the complete eradication of the island's vast palm forests. Scholars like Jared Diamond have pointed to the pollen records trapped in ancient lake beds which tell a stark story. The sediment layers show a dramatic and permanent shift, a sudden absence of tree pollen replaced by spores from ferns that thrive in eroded, barren soil. With the trees gone, the island's thin, fertile topsoil had no anchor. Torrential rains then washed it away into the sea, a process known as severe sheet erosion. The land's capacity to support life crumbled along with the soil. This environmental collapse triggered a horrific domino effect. As farming became impossible, famine spread. The social order, once centered on the ritual construction of the Moai, shattered. Archaeological evidence reveals a dark turn, with the discovery of ancient human bones showing clear signs of butchering and cooking, a grim testament to the desperation born from starvation. Society descended into violent conflict. People abandoned their open coastal villages and retreated to fortified caves and makeshift settlements further inland, a desperate attempt to protect the little that remained. The arrival of Europeans in the 18th century was merely the final, cruel blow to a society already in its death throes. They brought devastating new diseases and conducted brutal slave raids, but the internal ecological collapse had already sealed the island's fate. The population, which may have once numbered in the thousands, plummeted to just a handful of survivors. How does extreme isolation turn an environmental mistake into an inescapable trap? On Easter Island, there was no neighboring land to flee to, no new resources to trade for. Every decision was final, and every tree cut down was gone forever. Their world was a closed system, and they reached its limits. this forces a haunting question upon our own globalized civilization. Is our entire planet not also an island floating in the vast emptiness of space? Are we, with our global deforestation and soil degradation, simply repeating the story of Rapa Nui on a much grander, more terrifying scale? Their tragedy is a stark warning about the ultimate cost of living beyond our environmental means, a lesson written in the silent, eroded earth and the stoic faces of the Moe. This narrative of land giving way finds a terrifying parallel in a civilization that literally sank beneath the waves, a kingdom lost to coastal subsidence. The Great Plain of Doggerland vanished beneath the waves. For thousands of years, this vast, fertile landscape connected Britain to the European continent, a low-lying world of hills, rivers, and marshes teeming with wildlife and supporting communities of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Then, around 6200 BCE, the sea took it all back. The drowning of Doggerland was a slow-motion cataclysm, driven by the relentless rise in sea levels as the last great ice sheets melted. But its finale may have been shockingly swift. Geologists point to a specific catastrophe, the Storegga Slide, a colossal underwater landslide off the coast of Norway. This collapse of the continental shelf sent a tsunami racing across the North Sea, a towering wall of water that would have smashed into the already waterlogged coasts of Doggerland, scouring the low-lying plains and delivering a final, devastating blow to a land already in retreat. Researchers like Vincent Gaffney have used seismic data to map this lost world, revealing the sunken river valleys and hills that once defined this populated landscape. The evidence for human life here is pulled from the sea itself. Fishermen's nets have dredged up not just fish, but ancient worked flint tools, the bones of mammoths, and even peat from the preserved forest floors that now lie deep under the seabed. Each artifact is a ghost from a drowned continent. The slow inundation forced a massive, long-term human migration. Communities that had lived for generations on this plain were pushed relentlessly toward higher ground, into what became the coastlines of Britain and mainland Europe. This displacement would have compressed populations, altered territorial boundaries, and likely sparked conflicts over dwindling resources, fundamentally reshaping the cultural map of prehistoric Europe. Could ancient oral traditions like flood myths found in numerous cultures be distant, fragmented memories of this great loss? The story of Doggerland forces us to ask a pressing question. How do modern coastal cities from Miami to Mumbai face a similar threat from rising seas today? The people of Doggerland had no choice but to move, and their experience shows that climate-induced displacement is not a new phenomenon, but a deeply ancient one. It is a lesson in managed retreat, a reminder that sometimes the most resilient response is to adapt and migrate. The slow, relentless power of the ocean that consumed Doggerland finds a terrifying parallel in a cataclysm of sudden, unleashed freshwater, a glacial flood of unimaginable scale. High in the Andes, a different kind of water catastrophe was brewing, one born not from the sea but from the mountains themselves. The sophisticated empires of the Andes, like the Tiwanaku and Weri, built their civilizations in a challenging world of high altitude and stark climate contrast. Their success was a testament to human ingenuity, until a climatic shift turned their greatest asset into a weapon against them. Around 1000 CE, the medieval warm period began to accelerate the melting of the glaciers that crowned the Andean peaks. This created vast, unstable lakes dammed only by walls of ice and rock. When these natural dams failed, they unleashed glacial lake outburst floods, colossal waves of water, ice, and rock that thundered down the mountainsides with biblical force. These were not ordinary floods, they were singular, catastrophic events that scoured entire valleys clean. At the magnificent urban center of Tiwanaku, archaeologists like Alan Carlotta have uncovered evidence of this disaster. Distinct layers of coarse sediment deposited far from any river blanket the remains of the city's intricate agricultural infrastructure. The very canals and raised fields that once made the harsh altiplano bloom were smashed and buried under meters of debris, their carefully managed hydrology rendered useless in a single, violent episode. This was a collapse from the heights. The floodwaters did not just destroy physical structures, they shattered the economic and spiritual foundation of the empire. The raised field systems around Lake Titicaca, which had supported a large, centralized population, were obliterated. Famine would have been immediate and severe, leading to a crisis of faith in the rulers who were believed to maintain a covenant with the mountain gods. The geological destruction triggered social unraveling. The central authority, unable to protect its people or provide food, lost its legitimacy. What followed was a deliberate fragmentation, a return to smaller, more resilient communities that could adapt to the new, unpredictable reality. The great cities were gradually abandoned, their stone monuments left to the winds of the high plain. How does a society recover when its entire agricultural system is erased in a day? The Andean response was not to rebuild the old empire, but to disperse and innovate on a smaller scale, a pattern of resilience we have seen before. This story forces a stark question for our modern world. As global warming accelerates glacial melt today, millions of people living in the shadow of mountains from the Himalayas to the Andes now face the same threat of catastrophic outburst floods. Are our own densely populated valleys any safer from the fury of a mountain's unleashed water? The fate of the Tiwanaku is a powerful lesson in how a civilization's greatest strength, its mastery of a specific environment, can become its ultimate vulnerability when that environment is violently transformed. This pattern of a society reaching its limits through expansion and complexity leads us to a different kind of collapse, one driven not by nature's force, but by the sheer weight of its own ambition. Even the grandest of monuments can stand upon a fragile foundation. The soaring towers of Angkor Wat, a testament to the Khmer Empire's power, rose from a landscape meticulously engineered by water. A sprawling network of canals and vast reservoirs called barrays transformed the Cambodian jungle into a fertile heartland, supporting one of the most impressive civilizations in Southeast Asia. Yet this very system, a marvel of hydraulic engineering, would ultimately contribute to the empire's slow, grinding collapse around the 15th century. The Khmer's greatness was undone not by a single enemy, but by a creeping convergence of environmental stress and societal overextension. Scientists like Brendan Buckley have analyzed ancient tree rings from the region, and the data reveals a terrifying pattern. The empire was struck by decades of severe drought, punctuated by periods of intensely powerful monsoons. This climatic whiplash was more than their intricate water network could bear. During the droughts, the great reservoirs and canals ran dangerously low, causing widespread crop failure and famine. When the fierce rains finally came, they would have washed torrents of eroded soil into the waterways, silting them up and reducing their capacity for the next dry spell. The system began to choke on its own complexity. Maintaining this vast infrastructure required a massive, centralized workforce and a stable, powerful government. As the climate grew more erratic, the political will and resources needed to constantly dredge canals and repair dams likely faltered. The archaeological record shows this decline etched into the land itself. Canals became clogged with sediment, and massive barrays were abandoned, their basins slowly filling with silt and vegetation. This environmental and administrative decay made the empire profoundly vulnerable. Weakened by famine and internal strife, the Khmer could no longer effectively resist external pressures from rival kingdoms. The heart of the empire simply could not sustain its population. In a final, telling exodus, the political and religious elite gradually abandoned the magnificent city of Angkor, shifting their power base south to coastal areas like Phnom Penh, where trade and more reliable water sources offered a new beginning. The grand capital was slowly reclaimed by the jungle, its temples standing as silent sentinels to a forgotten glory. How does a society's greatest achievement become its greatest liability? The Khmer Empire did not fall because its engineering was flawed, but because its complex system lost the flexibility to adapt to a changing world. Their story forces a critical question for modern megacities from Phoenix to Cape Town, places that rely on equally complex and massive water management projects. Are we, in our own age of engineering marvels, building systems so intricate that they could become impossible to sustain when the climate inevitably shifts? The Khmer collapse is a masterclass in the danger of peak complexity, a warning that the very sophistication we rely on can make us brittle. This slow surrender to an unyielding environment finds a starkly different, yet equally relentless, parallel in a civilization that was not drowned by water but consumed by sand. The legendary city of Ubar, a jewel of the Arabian desert, was devoured by the very ground it stood upon. Known in folklore as Aram of the Pillars, this fabled hub of the frankincense trade vanished around 300 CE, not to a conqueror's army, but to a creeping invasion of sand. The city's collapse was a physical sinking, a literal swallowing by the earth. Beneath its foundations lay a network of limestone caverns, hollowed out over millennia by ancient water flows. As the climate grew drier and the inhabitants drew more heavily on the scarce water resources, the water table dropped, destabilizing these underground chambers. The ground above simply gave way, collapsing into massive sinkholes that dragged buildings and streets down into the darkness. This geological betrayal was then sealed by the desert itself. Shifting sands driven by intensifying winds poured into the ruins, burying the city and making the area completely uninhabitable. For centuries, Ubar was considered mere myth, a cautionary tale from the Quran. Then, an archaeological expedition led by Joris Zarins used satellite imagery and remote sensing to pinpoint its location in modern-day Oman. What they unearthed confirmed the cataclysm. They found the remnants of a large fortress with walls tilted at violent angles, collapsed into a massive sinkhole. All around, the evidence was clear. Layers of sand had inundated the site, preserving pottery and other artifacts in a sandy tomb that spoke of a sudden, desperate abandonment. This environmental disaster severed the lifeblood of the city, the lucrative frankincense trade routes that stretched across the desert. With their city destroyed and their economy obliterated, the population had no choice but to disperse into the harsh desert, their once great civilization fading into legend. How do such myths and legends arise from real historical collapses? The story of Ubar suggests they are born from a collective memory of a trauma so complete it defies simple explanation, transforming a complex environmental disaster into a divine punishment for hubris in the popular imagination. And this forces a stark question for our own time. Are modern desert cities from Phoenix to Dubai facing a similar, slow-motion threat as their own water usage strains ancient aquifers and expanding deserts press in from all sides? The earth does not always shake to bring a civilization down. Sometimes it simply opens its mouth and swallows. This narrative of a society cut off from its lifeblood by environmental decay finds a powerful parallel in a collapse driven by a different kind of isolation, when a vital trade route was severed by political chaos. A silent killer traveled the ancient Silk roads long before silk was ever traded. The Oxus civilization, a sophisticated culture of fortress cities and master metalworkers, thrived in the heart of Central Asia, its wealth flowing through a network of trade routes linking Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Then, around 1800 BCE, its bustling urban centers fell quiet. The cause of this collapse appears to be a dual catastrophe, where a biological threat exploited an economic weakness. Archaeologists like Frederick Hebert point to a perfect storm of misfortunes, where epidemic diseases, likely spread by the very merchants and travelers who were the civilization's lifeblood, swept through the populated oases. Imagine a deadly pathogen, something akin to a prehistoric plague, moving faster than news of its arrival. In a society dependent on constant interaction, a pandemic would have been devastating. It would have decimated the population, not just killing people but crippling the specialized labor force needed for their renowned metallurgy and ceramics. The evidence on the ground is haunting. At major sites like Gona-de-Pere, one of the empire's grandest cities, we see signs of a rapid and unplanned abandonment. There are discoveries of unburied human remains, suggesting a society so overwhelmed by death that standard funeral rites were abandoned. This was not a planned migration, it was a societal shutdown. The loss of people directly led to the collapse of their complex economy. With fewer artisans to produce goods and fewer merchants to transport them, the trade routes that brought prosperity began to wither. This economic fracture was then compounded by other pressures, a drying climate that strained agriculture and incursions by nomadic groups from the steppes. But the critical blow was likely the plague itself. The result was a cultural amnesia. The unique artistic styles, the advanced architectural knowledge, and the intricate metalworking techniques that defined the Oxus civilization simply vanished. Later cultures in the region built on entirely different foundations, with no memory of the master builders who came before. How do the very networks that bring a society immense wealth also open the door to its destruction? The Oxus collapse is a stark lesson in the double-edged sword of globalization. Their trade routes were conduits for both riches and ruin, a pattern we see echoed in our own hyper-connected world, where a virus can circle the globe in a matter of days. It forces us to ask a profound question. Can a disease alone cause a civilization to vanish? For the Oxus people, the answer seems to be yes, when that disease severs the vital connections that hold a complex society together. Their world did not end with a bang, but with a feverish whisper and the closing of a trade route. This story of a society succumbing to the pressures of a connected world finds a terrifying parallel in a cataclysm of a far more elemental force, as the very ocean rose to reclaim a kingdom. The ocean did not rage, it simply advanced, swallowing a continent in slow motion. For thousands of years, the Sunda Shelf formed a vast, low-lying peninsula connecting the islands of Southeast Asia into a single, sprawling landmass. Early human cultures thrived on this exposed plain, hunting in its forests and foraging along its river systems. Then, as the last ice age waned, the world warmed and the seas began their relentless climb. This was the Great Marine Transgression, a cataclysm measured not in moments but in millennia, yet its impact was no less profound. Around 7000 BCE, the rising waters breached the final barriers, inundating an area twice the size of India and permanently redrawing the map of the world. The slow, creeping flood forced a massive, continuous human migration. Coastal settlements were abandoned again and again as people retreated toward the interior highlands that would become the isolated islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. Geologists have mapped this drowned world, revealing the sunken river valleys and hills that once formed a connected landscape. The evidence of this lost world is pulled from the sea and from the land. In the caves of Borneo, archaeological digs show clear layers of human occupation, followed by a sterile layer of marine sediment, a stark line marking the moment the sea claimed the land. Fishermen's nets in the Java Sea have hauled up ancient stone tools, ghostly artifacts from a time when their fishing grounds were rolling hills and forested valleys. This immense displacement likely forged new societies. Some scholars suggest that the roots of the later Nusantau, a vast maritime trading network, lie in these early displacements, as displaced populations turned to the sea that had taken their land, becoming the master navigators of the Pacific. How do rising seas force a fundamental cultural evolution? The flooding of Sunderland shows that environmental pressure can be a brutal yet powerful engine for innovation, forcing hunter-gatherers to become islanders and then sailors. This ancient event holds up a mirror to our own time. With modern sea levels projected to rise for centuries, are we facing a displacement of a similar continental scale? The story of Sunderland is a lesson in managed retreat on a geological timescale, a reminder that the relationship between land and sea is never static, and that human geography is forever at the mercy of the ocean's rise. This narrative of a world fragmented by water finds a chilling parallel in a civilization that collapsed not from a lack of resources, but from being utterly and completely cut off from them. Their world was shrinking, gripped by a cold that would not relent. The Norse settlements in Greenland, founded during the warm centuries of Viking expansion, faced a slow and silent end. By the 1400s, the last of these hardy Scandinavian outposts were abandoned, not to a dramatic invasion, but to the crushing pressures of isolation and a changing climate. Their collapse is a masterclass in the danger of cultural rigidity. The Norse had established two primary settlements, the Eastern and Western, during the favorable conditions of the medieval warm period. They built stone churches and raised farms, replicating a European lifestyle on the very edge of the habitable world. Their society was built on a fragile balance, dependent on livestock like cattle and sheep, and on vital trade with the homeland for essential goods like iron and timber. Then the climate turned. The Little Ice Age began to tighten its grip, bringing colder temperatures and a significantly shorter growing season. The pastures that fed their livestock grew sparse, and the sea ice expanded, blocking the vital shipping lanes to Iceland and Norway for longer and longer periods. Research by anthropologist Thomas McGovern highlights a critical failure in their response. The Norse, despite living alongside the skilled Inuit hunters for generations, stubbornly refused to adopt their survival techniques. They did not learn to hunt seals and whales from kayaks in the open water, nor did they fully embrace fishing. They clung to their identity as cattle farmers and their European traditions, even as their own way of life became impossible to sustain. Archaeological evidence from Middens, the ancient garbage dumps, tells a grim story of this decline. The bones of wild game, which could have provided a crucial food source, are almost entirely absent. Instead, the Norse relied more and more on their own starving livestock. Analysis of skeletal remains from the final generations reveals shocking signs of chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and diseases linked to severe nutritional deficiency. They were quite literally starving to death, surrounded by a sea full of protein they refused to harvest. This internal failure was compounded by external pressures. As resources dwindled, relations with the Inuit, who were far better adapted to the harsh environment, likely grew tense and sometimes violent. The loss of external support was the final blow. The last recorded ship from Norway arrived around the late 1300s. After that, the settlements were completely cut off. The silence that fell over Greenland is hauntingly captured at the site of Valsey. Here in the stone church, the last recorded event in Norse Greenland was a wedding in 1408. After that, there is only silence. No more ships, no more records, just empty farms slowly being buried by the cold earth. How does a culture's very identity, its traditions and beliefs, become a trap that prevents its survival? The Greenland Norse were not ignorant, they were deeply committed to their way of life. But their unwillingness to adapt, to learn from their neighbors and change their practices, sealed their fate. Their story forces a stark question upon our own world. In an age of climate change, are there modern communities or even entire industries clinging to outdated models with a similar cultural rigidity? The Norse collapse teaches us that resilience is not just about strength, but about flexibility. It is a tragic lesson in what happens when a people, isolated and under pressure, choose tradition over transformation. This failure to adapt to a changing world finds a terrifying parallel in a cataclysm that struck from the sky, not with cold, but with a darkness that blotted out the sun itself. The sun dimmed as if shrouded in perpetual twilight. In the year 536, a strange and terrifying dust veil settled over the northern hemisphere, casting a pall that would last for 18 months. Ancient historians from Rome to China wrote of a sun that gave no more warmth than the moon, and of a summer that never arrived. This was not a local weather event, but a global climate catastrophe, a volcanic winter triggered by a colossal eruption, possibly from Iceland or North America. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica hold the chemical proof, revealing a massive spike in sulfate deposits right at this exact time, the unmistakable fingerprint of a volcano that hurled so much ash and sulfur into the stratosphere that it cooled the entire planet. The immediate effect was agricultural collapse. With sunlight blocked and temperatures plummeting, crops failed from Europe to Asia. Famines spread, weakening populations and making them horrifically vulnerable to disease. Historian Michael McCormick links this environmental shock directly to the arrival of the Justinian plague just a few years later, a pandemic that ravaged the Byzantine Empire and killed tens of millions. The mighty Byzantine Empire, already straining under the weight of war and a crippled economy, began a slow decline from which it would never fully recover. In China, dynasties faced similar turmoil, with records speaking of widespread starvation and social unrest. Even in the fledgling Merovingian kingdoms of Europe, written sources describe years without a summer, where frosts coated the ground in July and desperate communities faced starvation. How does a single geological event on the other side of the world trigger economic collapse, mass migration, and pandemic across entire continents? The event of 536 is the ultimate example of a global domino effect in the ancient world. It proves that even societies separated by vast distances were linked by a shared atmosphere, a shared climate. This forces a critical question for our modern, hyper-connected civilization. If a similar volcanic winter occurred today, our advanced technology might offer some warning, but could it save global agriculture from total failure? Our just-in-time food supply chains would snap under the strain, and the resulting societal unrest would be unimaginable. The darkness of 536 reveals a profound truth, that human history can be reset not by kings or armies, but by the fire of a single, angry mountain. This narrative of a world destabilized by a single point of geological fury finds a slower, more deliberate parallel in a cataclysm of riverine change, where a civilization's lifeblood was systematically stolen. The great city of Cahokia, with its towering earthen mounds, began to lose its heartbeat. Around 1350 CE, this bustling metropolis on the Mississippi floodplain, a nexus of culture and trade, entered a period of irreversible decline, and the river that had given it life was a primary cause of its demise. The Mississippi River system is not a static entity, but a dynamic, shifting force. geological studies of the region reveal a history of avulsion, where the river would abruptly change its course, abandoning old channels for new ones. For the people of Cahokia, this meant that the predictable hydrology they depended upon for their sophisticated agriculture became dangerously unpredictable. These river shifts brought cycles of intense flooding, followed by periods when water was suddenly too distant. Archaeological layers at the site tell a story of repeated inundation, with distinct bands of floodborne silt interrupting the layers of human occupation, evidence of a landscape in constant, stressful flux. The city's centerpiece, the colossal Monk's Mound, itself began to suffer. Erosion and waterlogging from the altered water table caused slumping on its massive terraces, a physical symbol of the civilization's failing stability. This environmental pressure triggered a cascade of other problems. To build their mounds and to fuel their growing population, the Cahokians engaged in widespread deforestation of the surrounding bluffs. With the trees gone, rainfall ran off the land more quickly, carrying precious topsoil with it and exacerbating the flooding issues, creating a vicious cycle of environmental degradation. As resources grew scarce and the land became less reliable, social order frayed. Archaeologist Timothy Pocketat points to the sudden construction of a massive wooden palisade, a 3-kilometer-long stockade wall around the central ceremonial precinct. This was not a symbol of power but one of fear, a clear indication of rising internal conflict and a society turning inward for protection. The response was not revolution but dispersal. The grand urban experiment was simply abandoned. The population gradually migrated away from the city center, splintering into smaller, more manageable villages or joining other groups in different regions. The great plaza fell silent, and the mounds, once teeming with ritual and activity, were left to the elements. How does a civilization founded on the bounty of a great river cope when that river becomes an agent of chaos? Cahokia's story is a powerful lesson in the delicate, often volatile, partnership between human settlement and the waterways that sustain it. For modern cities built on the floodplains of powerful rivers from St. Louis to New Orleans, this ancient collapse poses an urgent question. Are our own levees and control systems truly mastering these dynamic systems? Or are we merely setting the stage for a future and potentially greater failure? The people of Cahokia did not conquer their river, they adapted to its rhythm until that rhythm changed beyond their capacity to endure, a poignant reminder that the foundations of even the greatest cities can be washed away. This narrative of a society fragmenting under environmental and social stress leads us to our final, and perhaps most subtle, cataclysm. Their world was thrown into a sudden, unnatural winter. Across North America, the highly specialized Clovis people, master hunters of the great mammoths and mastodons, faced a cataclysm that arrived from the stars. Around 12,800 years ago, a mysterious event triggered the Younger Dryas period, a dramatic and rapid return to Ice Age conditions after a long warming trend. The leading explanation for this sudden freeze is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which suggests a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere above the continent. The force of this cosmic blast would have been unimaginable, igniting continent-spanning wildfires and throwing up a veil of dust and soot that blotted out the sun for years. This was not a slow change, but an instantaneous environmental reset that shattered the foundations of the Clovis way of life. The evidence for this impact is etched into the earth itself. At numerous Clovis sites, researchers like James Kennett have identified a distinct, dark band of sediment known as the black mat. This layer acts as a stark dividing line in time. Below it, we find the classic, finely crafted stone spear points of the Clovis people, often alongside the bones of mammoths. Above this black layer, both the distinct Clovis technology and the megafauna vanish, replaced by the tools of smaller, more isolated groups. Within this black mat, scientists have found a cocktail of exotic materials, including microscopic nanodiamonds and layers of soot, which are telltale signs of extreme heat and pressure consistent with an extraterrestrial impact. The ecological consequences were immediate and devastating. The wildfires would have decimated forests and grasslands, while the ensuing impact winter crippled plant growth. The great beasts that the Clovis hunters relied upon, creatures like the mammoth and the giant ground sloth, could not survive this abrupt double blow of habitat loss and climatic shift. Their extinction was swift. Overnight, the primary food source and the very cultural identity of the Clovis people disappeared. How does a society built around hunting giants survive when the giants are all gone? The Clovis response was not to perish but to transform. Forced into a world without mammoths, their large, cohesive groups fragmented. They dispersed into smaller, more mobile bands and began to innovate. The archaeological record shows a dramatic shift in their toolkits. The iconic, fluted Clovis point gave way to a dazzling array of regional styles, from the graceful Folsom points designed for hunting the smaller bison to a new emphasis on gathering plants and hunting smaller game. This was not a collapse into darkness, but a creative explosion born of necessity. The Clovis culture as a unified entity vanished, but its people did not. They adapted, diversified, and became the ancestors of the incredible tapestry of Native American cultures that would later flourish across the continents. Their story is the ultimate lesson in human resilience. It forces us to ask a profound question about our own era of rapid climate change and potential ecological disruption. When faced with an extinction-level event, can our global society demonstrate the same flexibility and ingenuity as those ancient hunters? The legacy of the Clovis people is not one of failure, but of rebirth, a powerful reminder that even a cataclysm from the heavens can become the catalyst for a new chapter in the human story. These ancient collapses whisper a consistent, chilling truth across the centuries. Whether shattered by a volcano's fury or starved by a river's betrayal, these civilizations stumbled over the same fault lines. Their stories are not just isolated tragedies, but a collection of stark warnings, a pattern of vulnerability that repeats itself again and again. One of the most common threads is environmental overreach. The Garamantes drained their fossil water, the Rapa Nui felled their last tree, and the Khmer built a system so complex it could not bend when the climate whipped. They all pushed against a natural limit until it pushed back with overwhelming force. Another fatal pattern is societal rigidity. The Greenland Norse starved surrounded by a protein-rich sea, their identity as European farmers trapping them in a failing model. They could not or would not learn from their Inuit neighbors and adapt. This stands in stark contrast to the Clovis people, whose entire world vanished with the mammoths, yet who transformed their technology and social structure to survive. Their story shows that collapse is not always the end. It can be a brutal, painful rebirth. The most terrifying collapses, however, were those born from a perfect storm. The Bronze Age did not fall to a single enemy, but to a cascade of climate change, mass migration, and internal failure. Their interconnected world became their greatest weakness, as a shock in one region rippled across the entire system, snapping every strand at once. So what does this mean for us here and now? Our global civilization is the ultimate expression of complexity and interconnection. We rely on just-in-time supply chains, vast digital networks, and intricate infrastructure that would make the Khmer or the Minoans gasp. We are drawing down aquifers like the Garamantes, degrading our soils like the people of Rapa Nui, and facing a climate shift as profound as the one that doomed the Akkadians. The lessons are not subtle. Resilience is not about building higher walls or more complex systems. It is about building inflexibility, fostering the ability to adapt when the unexpected inevitably occurs. It is about learning to read the environmental signals and having the courage to change course before the ground literally disappears beneath our feet. These 20 forgotten cataclysms are more than history. They are a mirror. By studying how these societies fractured, we are not just unearthing their past, we are decoding a manual for our own survival. The choice is ours whether we heed its pages. Our journey through 20 forgotten cataclysms reveals a pattern as old as civilization itself. From the fire of Thera to the ice that gripped the Clovis hunters, these stories are bound by a single, sobering truth. Human ambition, for all its brilliance, exists in a delicate dance with a powerful and often unpredictable natural world. These were not random tragedies, but profound lessons etched into the ruins of history. They teach us about resilience in the face of the unthinkable, about the absolute necessity of adaptation when the old ways fail, and about the severe consequences of mismanaging the very environment that sustains us. As our modern world grapples with its own global challenges, from climate shifts to resource scarcity, these ancient echoes are more relevant than ever. They are not tales of doom, but a call to build societies that are sustainable, flexible, and wise enough to learn from the past. We would love to hear which of these cataclysms resonated most deeply with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this exploration, subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of our shared history. Thank you for joining this journey through time. May we carry its lessons forward, learning from the silent voices of the past to help safeguard our collective future.